Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the January 2025 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of Kapital, Volume 1, Chapter 6, The Buying and Selling of Labor Power by Karl Marx from 1867. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee at patreon.com/socialismforall or buymeacoffee.com/socialismforall. If you choose to support via Patreon, please use the website or the Android app to sign up. Using the Apple iOS app to sign up will stick you for an extra 30 to 40% per month, all of which goes to Apple. There are links to Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee in the video description. Alright, so we're up to Chapter 6 of Kapital Volume 1, which is the third and final section in Part 2, The Transformation of Money into Capital. As is implied by that title, money and capital are different things. As we covered in Part 1, money is a universal equivalent, a measure of value, and a medium of circulation, which assists in the exchange of commodities. Capital, on the other hand, is a kind of social weapon used to extract surplus value, which is the source of profit. So we've examined two circuits so far, C to M to C, which describes the exchange of commodities in order to meet needs, which is naturally limited by the wants and desires that fueled that process in the first place, and the circuit of capital, M to C to M prime, money to commodity to more money. And what that describes is not the selling of a good or service that you don't need in order to get money so that you can buy one that you do need. In other words, selling in order to buy. What M to C to M prime describes is buying in order to sell. You start with money, you use it to buy a commodity, and then you use the commodity to buy more money than you started with. And unlike the satisfaction of wants and desires, there is no inbuilt limit to seeking more and more and more money. But where does that extra money, the extra value, come from? Marx says that it's not about manipulating prices because that would basically wash out in the overall course of transactions in the market. No, there is an additional input, and he says that it's labor. But in capitalism, this is hidden. So basically, capitalism comes with a secret passenger on board. Wage slavery, making people work for free. Now, wage slavery isn't the same as chattel slavery, where people are outright owned as property. In wage slavery, people are at least nominally legally free and paid a wage in order that we can sustain our own lives. But as we're going to get into more in this chapter, what we're paid in wages is not the same as the value that our work produces. Instead, it's basically just enough to sustain us. So if there's a difference between the amount of value that a worker produces in the course of a day and what that worker is actually paid for that day, where does that difference go? That's right, it goes to the capitalist. That's the source of profit. It's just simply stolen value, or, as Marx called it, surplus value. Now, technically, it's not really stolen, because the agreement between the capitalist, or employer, and the worker, or employee, isn't that the employee is going to get the full value that they produce in the day. That's never what's agreed up front, which is actually what's unfair and wrong about the system. What is agreed upon is that they're going to get a certain wage, or salary, or piece rate. And yeah, if the capitalist doesn't even pay them that much, that's called wage theft. So liberals and other people who defend capitalism will sometimes go after employers who engage in wage theft because that even violates the terms of capitalism. It's even less fair than capitalism lays out in the first place. But even what capitalism lays out in the first place is unjust. And here we've reached the limits of liberalism and we've gone into socialism in our criticism. Because after all, why should we have a system where certain private individuals are able to own and run industry for their own benefit, and what they're basically engaging in with the overwhelming majority of the population is a system whereby they use capital, the resources that they control, to extract surplus value from the huge numbers of workers in their employ. Why is this system even tolerated? Anyway, that's some of what we're going to get into in Chapter 6, the buying and selling of labor power, which is what employees actually sell to the capitalist. And conversely, what the capitalist actually pays workers for, our capacity to work, which is the only commodity that we can consistently bring to market in order to get the money in the form of wages, in order to buy the commodified essentials that we need in order to live. If you've already read Marx's Wage, Labor, and Capital, which we have here on the channel, it's only 2 hours long and a very good introduction to all of these topics. You know that on average, the price of a commodity in the market comes out to the cost of its production. Certain sellers at times are able to sell over the average cost of production, and certain sellers at times have to sell for less than the average cost of production, but on the whole, the price of a commodity in the market is the average cost of production. And that goes for all commodities, including labor power that the proletariat has to sell. So what is the price of that labor power in the market, which is called wages? Well, it's the cost of producing the labor power, which means the body of the worker. So basically, it's subsistence. That's what workers get paid for in capitalism, and capitalists make profit by causing the workers to produce commodities, goods and services produced for exchange, with an overall higher value than the labor power that they are buying from the workers. Again, this difference Marx called surplus value. It is the source of profit, how the capitalist gets rich, or in other words, multiplies their capital, using the labor power sold to them by the workers. One last note before we begin, labor power is the capacity to work, and it's distinct from labor, which is the actual labor performed. Workers sell labor power, not actual labor. Alright, now let's get into Chapter 6, the buying and selling of labor power. The change in value that occurs in the case of money intended to be converted into capital cannot take place in the money itself, since in its function of means of purchase and of payment, it does no more than realize the price of the commodity it buys or pays for, and as hard cash, it is value petrified, never varying. Quoting Ricardo, in the form of money, capital is productive of no profit, unquote. Just as little can it originate in the second act of circulation, the resale of the commodity, which does no more than transform the article from its bodily form back again into its money form. The change must therefore take place in the commodity bought by the first act, M to C, but not in its value, for equivalents are exchanged, and the commodity is paid for at its full value. We are therefore forced to the conclusion that the change originates in the use value as such of the commodity, i.e. in its consumption. In order to be able to extract value from the consumption of a commodity, our friend Moneybags must be so lucky as to find, within the sphere of circulation, in the market, a commodity whose use value possesses the peculiar property of being a source of value, whose actual consumption, therefore, is itself an embodiment of labor, and consequently a creation of value. The possessor of money does find on the market such a special commodity in capacity for labor or labor power. By labor power, or capacity for labor, is to be understood the aggregate of those mental and physical capabilities existing in a human being, which they exercise whenever they produce a use value of any description. But in order that our owner of money may be able to find labor power offered for sale as a commodity, various conditions must first be fulfilled. The exchange of commodities of itself implies no other relations of dependence than those which result from its own nature. On this assumption, labor power can appear upon the market as a commodity only if, and so far as its possessor, the individual whose labor power it is, offers it for sale, or sells it as a commodity. In order that they may be able to do this, they must have it at their disposal, must be the untrammeled owner of their capacity for labor, i.e. of their person. Footnote here, in encyclopedias of classical antiquities we find such nonsense as this, that in the ancient world, capital was fully developed, quote, except that the free laborer and a system of credit was wanting, unquote. Mommsen also, in his History of Rome, commits in this respect one blunder after another. So commenting, we discussed the difference before between chattel slavery, where workers are not free and in control of their own person, legally, and then wage slavery, where you are. That's what we're talking about. Back to the main text. They and the owner of money meet in the market and deal with each other as on the basis of equal rights, with this difference alone, that one is buyer, the other seller, both therefore equal in the eyes of the law. The continuance of this relation demands that the owner of the labor power should sell it only for a definite period, for if they were to sell it rump and stump, once and for all, they would be selling themselves, converting themselves from a free person into a slave, from an owner of a commodity into a commodity. They must constantly look upon their labor power as their own property, their own commodity, and this they can do only by placing it at the disposal of the buyer temporarily, for a definite period of time. By this means alone they can avoid announcing their rights of ownership over it. Footnote here, hence legislation in various countries fixes a maximum for labor contracts. Wherever free labor is the rule, the laws regulate the mode of terminating this contract. In other words, ceasing the agreement to work for that employer or quitting. In some states, particularly in Mexico before the American Civil War, also in the territories taken from Mexico, and also as a matter of fact, in the Danubian provinces, till the revolution effected by Cusa, slavery is hidden under the form of peonage. by means of advances repayable in labor which are handed down from generation to generation. Not only the individual laborer, but their family become de facto the property of other persons and their families. Juarez abolished peonage. The so-called Emperor Maximilian reestablished it by a decree, which in the House of Representatives at Washington was aptly denounced as a decree for the reintroduction of slavery into Mexico. Quoting Hegel, "I may make over to another the use for a limited time of my particular bodily and mental aptitudes and capabilities, because in consequence of this restriction they are impressed with a character of alienation with regard to me as a whole. But by the alienation of all my labor time and the whole of my work, I should be converting the substance itself, in other words, my general activity and reality, my person, into the property of another." Unquote. Back to the main text. The second essential condition to the owner of money finding labor power in the market as a commodity is this, that the laborer, instead of being in the position to sell commodities in which their labor is incorporated, must be obliged to offer for sale as a commodity that very labor power, which exists only in their living self. So commenting here, Marx is basically saying, why would a person be selling labor power instead of goods and services that they produced with their labor power? Well, obviously they don't own their own business or shop or whatever. Now, the reasons for that are numerous potentially. One of the main ones is that many types of work are just simply not conducive to being run on that kind of individualistic basis. Many types of work require some kind of collaborative effort, like you're not just going to open a backyard nuclear power plant. For one thing, it requires way too many people to run. But let's assume for a minute you can get that many people together and willing to go into business. Why not do it as a cooperative? Well, it's also way too capital intensive. Most people just simply do not have anything to put up front, and those who do, the capitalists, want to use that capital as a social weapon to continue to extract surplus value for themselves. And there you have the basic standoff, or mutually antagonistic set of interests that constitutes the class struggle in capitalism. But Marx is going to go on to this condition of why would somebody be selling their labor power. Let's continue. In order that a person may be able to sell commodities other than labor power, they must of course have the means of production, as raw material, implements, etc. No boots can be made without leather, nor, I would add, the tools to shape it. They also require the means of subsistence. Nobody, not even a musician of the future, can live upon future products, or upon use values in an unfinished state. And ever since the first moment of our appearance on the world stage, humanity has always been, and must still be, a consumer, both before and while we are producing. Comment, in other words, we need to eat and have other inputs and resources to sustain ourselves. Continuing, in a society where all products assume the form of commodities, these commodities must be sold after they've been produced. It is only after their sale that they can serve in satisfying the requirements of their producer. The time necessary for their sale is superadded to that necessary for their production. For the conversion of their money into capital, therefore, the owner of money must meet in the market with the free laborer. Free in the double sense that as a free person they can dispose of their labor power as their own commodity, and that on the other hand they have no other commodity for sale, is short of everything necessary for the realization of their labor power, which is what they're getting from the capitalist, but not to own. The question why this free laborer confronts them in the market has no interest for the owner of money, who regards the labor market as a branch of the general market for commodities. And for the present, it interests us just as little. We cling to the fact theoretically as he does practically. One thing, however, is clear. Nature does not produce on the one side owners of money or commodities, and on the other people possessing nothing but their own labor power. This relation has no natural basis. Neither is its social basis one that is common to all historical periods. It is clearly the result of a past historical development, the product of many economic revolutions, of the extinction of a whole series of older forms of social production. Comment, so Marx is saying here that in order to get this whole lineup of conditions, a whole things have to have happened in the past. Humanity did not just wake up one day and find that these historical developments snapped into place. They occurred over a very long period of time. But once in place, this is what you get. Continuing, so too the economic categories already discussed by us bear the stamp of history. Definite historical conditions are necessary that a product may become a commodity. It must not be produced as the immediate means of subsistence of the producer themselves. Comment, because remember, a commodity is a good or service produced for exchange. Continuing, had we gone further and inquired under what circumstances all, or even the majority of products take the form of commodities, we should have found that this can only happen with production of a very specific kind, capitalist production. Such an inquiry, however, would have been foreign to the analysis of commodities. Production and circulation of commodities can take place, although the great mass of the objects produced are intended for the immediate requirements of their producers, are not turned into commodities, and consequently, social production is not yet by a long way dominated in its length and breadth by exchange value. The appearance of products as commodities presupposes such a development of the social division of labor, that the separation of use value from exchange value, a separation which first begins with barter, must already have been completed. But such a degree of development is common to many forms of society, which in other respects present the most varying historical features. On the other hand, if we consider money, its existence implies a definite stage in the exchange of commodities. The particular functions of money which it performs, either as the mere equivalent of commodities, or as means of circulation, or means of payment, as hoard, or as universal money, point, according to the extent and relative preponderance of the one function or the other, to very different stages in the process of social production. Yet we know by experience that a circulation of commodities relatively primitive suffices for the production of all these forms. Otherwise, with capital, the historical conditions of its existence are by no means given with the mere circulation of money and commodities. It can spring into life only when the owner of the means of production and subsistence meets in the market with the free laborer selling their labor power. And this one historical condition comprises a world's history. Capital, therefore, announces from its first appearance a new epoch in the process of social production. Comment: Marx is saying, in other words, that the development of capitalism was the product of all human history up to that point. There's a footnote here. The capitalist epoch is therefore characterized by this, that labor power takes in the eyes of the laborer themselves the form of a commodity which is their property. Their labor consequently becomes wage labor. On the other hand, it is only from this moment that the produce of labor universally becomes a commodity. Back to the main text. We must now examine more closely this peculiar commodity, labor power. Like all others, it has a value. Quoting Hobbes, the value or worth of a man, as is of all other things their price, that is to say, so much as would be given for the use of his power. Unquote. How is that value determined? The value of labor power is determined, as in the case of every other commodity, by the labor time necessary for the production, and consequently also the reproduction, of this special article. So far as it has value, it represents no more than a definite quantity of the average labor of society incorporated in it. Labor power exists only as a capacity, or power, of the living individual. Its production consequently presupposes their existence. Given the individual, the production of labor power consists in their reproduction of themselves or their maintenance. For their maintenance, they require a given quantity of the means of subsistence. Therefore, the labor time requisite for the production of labor power reduces itself to that necessary for the production of those means of subsistence. In other words, the value of labor power is the value of the means of subsistence necessary for the maintenance of the laborer. Labor power, however, becomes a reality only by its exercise. It sets itself in action only by working. But thereby, a definite quantity of human muscle, nerve, brain, etc. is wasted, and these require to be restored. This increased expenditure demands a larger income. Hence the Roman Villicus, as overlooker of the agricultural slaves, received, quote, more meager fare than working slaves, because his work was lighter, unquote. If the owner of labor power works today, tomorrow they must again be able to repeat the same process in the same conditions as regards health and strength. Their means of subsistence must therefore be sufficient to maintain them in their normal state as a laboring individual. Their natural wants, such as food, clothing, fuel, and housing, vary according to the climatic and other physical conditions of their country. On the other hand, the number and extent of their so-called necessary wants, as also the modes of satisfying them, are themselves the product of historical development, and depend therefore to a great degree on the extent of civilization of a country, more particularly on the conditions under which, and consequently on the habits and degree of comfort in which, the class of free laborers has been formed. Footnote here, compare Thornton in Overpopulation and its Remedy. Main text. In contradistinction, therefore, to the case of other commodities, there enters into the determination of the value of labor power a historical and moral element. Nevertheless, in a given country at a given period, the average quantity of the means of subsistence necessary for the laborer is practically known. The owner of labor power is mortal. If then their appearance in the market is to be continuous, and the continuous conversion of money into capital assumes this, the seller of labor power must perpetuate themselves, quoting Petty, in the way that every living individual perpetuates themselves, by procreation, unquote. The labor power withdrawn from the market by wear and tear and death must be continually replaced by, at the very least, an equal amount of fresh labor power. Hence, the sum of the means of subsistence necessary for the production of labor power must include the means necessary for the laborer's substitutes, i.e. their children, in order that this race of peculiar commodity owners may perpetuate its appearance in the market. Quoting Tarns, labor's natural price consists in such a quantity of necessaries and comforts of life as, from the nature of the climate and the habits of the country, are necessary to support the laborer, and to enable them to rear such a family as may preserve, in the market, an undiminished supply of labor. And Marx notes that the word labor here is wrongly used, should be using labor power. Back to the main text. In order to modify the human organism so that it may acquire skill and handiness in a given branch of industry and become labor power of a special kind, a special education or training is requisite, and this, on its part, costs an equivalent in commodities of a greater or lesser amount. This amount varies according to the more or less complicated character of the labor power. The expenses of this education, excessively small in the case of ordinary labor power, enter pro tanto into the total value spent in its production. The value of labor power resolves itself into the value of a definite quantity of the means of subsistence. It therefore varies with the value of these means, or with the quantity of labor requisite for their production. Some of the means of subsistence, such as food and fuel, are consumed daily, and a fresh supply must be provided daily. Others, such as clothes and furniture, last for longer periods and require to be replaced only at longer intervals. One article must be bought or paid for daily, another weekly, another quarterly, and so on. But in whatever way the sum total of these outlays may be spread over the year, they must be covered by the average income, taking one day with another. If the total of the commodities required daily for the production of labor power equals A, and those required weekly equals B, and those required quarterly equals C, and so on, the daily average of these commodities equals 365A plus 52B plus 4C, etc., divided by 365. Suppose that in this mass of commodities requisite for the average day, there are embodied 6 hours of social labor. Then there is incorporated daily in labor power half a day's average social labor. In other words, half a day's labor is requisite for the daily production of labor power. This quantity of labor forms the value of a day's labor power, or the value of the labor power daily reproduced. If half a day's average social labor is incorporated in 3 shillings, then 3 shillings is the price corresponding to the value of a day's labor power. If its owner therefore offers it for sale at 3 shillings a day, its selling price is equal to its value. And according to our supposition, our friend Moneybags, who is intent upon converting his 3 shillings into capital, pays this value. The minimum limit of the value of labor power is determined by the value of the commodities, without the daily supply of which the laborer cannot renew their vital energy, consequently by the value of those means of subsistence that are physically indispensable. If the price of labor power fall to this minimum, it falls below its value, since under such circumstances it can be maintained and developed only in a crippled state. But the value of every commodity is determined by the labor time requisite to turn it out, so as to be of normal quality. It is a very cheap sort of sentimentality which declares this method of determining the value of labor power, a method prescribed by the very nature of the case, to be a brutal method, and which wails with Rossi that, quote, to comprehend capacity for labor, or power of work, at the same time that we make abstraction from the means of subsistence of the laborers during the process of production, is to comprehend a phantom. When we speak of labor, or capacity for labor, we speak at the same time of the laborer and their means of subsistence, of labor and wages, unquote. When we speak of capacity for labor, we do not speak of labor any more than when we speak of capacity for digestion, we speak of digestion. The latter process requires something more than a good stomach. When we speak of capacity for labor, we do not abstract from the necessary means of subsistence. On the contrary, their value is expressed in its value. If their capacity for labor remains unsold, the laborer derives no benefit from it, but rather they will feel it to be a cruel nature-imposed necessity that this capacity has cost for its production a definite amount of the means of subsistence, and that it will continue to do so for its reproduction. They will then agree with Sismondi, quote, that capacity for labor is nothing unless it's sold, unquote. One consequence of the peculiar nature of labor power as a commodity is that its use value does not, on the conclusion of the contract between buyer and seller, immediately pass into the hands of the former. Its value, like that of every other commodity, is already fixed before it goes into circulation, since a definite quantity of social labor has been spent upon it, but its use value consists in the subsequent exercise of its force. the alienation of labor power, and its actual appropriation by the buyer, its employment as a use value, are separated by an interval of time. But in those cases in which the formal alienation by sale of the use value of a commodity is not simultaneous with its actual delivery to the buyer, the money of the latter usually functions as a means of payment. Quoting an inquiry into those principles respecting the nature of demand, etc., all labor is paid after it has ceased, unquote. And quoting Ganil, the system of commercial credit had to start at the moment when the laborer, the prime creator of products, could, thanks to their savings, wait for their wages until the end of the week, unquote. In every country in which the capitalist mode of production reigns, it is the custom not to pay for labor power before it has been exercised for the period fixed by the contract, as for example, the end of each week. In all cases, therefore, the use value of the labor power is advanced to the capitalist. The laborer allows the buyer to consume it before they receive payment of the price. They everywhere give credit to the capitalist. That this credit is no mere fiction is shown not only by the occasional loss of wages on the bankruptcy of the capitalist, but also by a series of more enduring consequences. Quoting Storch, the laborer lends their industry, but, Storch adds slyly, they risk nothing except the loss of their wages. The laborer does not hand over anything of a material nature, unquote. And in an example of the more enduring consequences, in London there are two sorts of bakers, the quote full-priced, who sell bread at its full value, and the quote undersellers, who sell it under its value. The latter class comprises more than 3/4 of the total number of bakers. That's according to the report of H.S. Tremenhere, commissioner to examine into the grievances complained of by the journeyman bakers. The undersellers, almost without exception, sell bread adulterated with alum, soap, pearl ashes, Derbyshire stone dust, and such like agreeable, nourishing, and wholesome ingredients. Sir John Gordon stated before the committee of 1855 that, quote, in consequence of these adulterations, the poor man, who lives on 2 pounds of bread a day, does not now get 1/4 part of nourishing matter, let alone the deleterious effects on his health, unquote. Tremenhere states as the reason why a very large part of the working class, although well aware of this adulteration, nevertheless accept the alum, stone dust, etc. as part of their purchase, that it is for them, quote, a matter of necessity to take from their baker or from the chandler's shop such bread as they choose to supply, unquote. As they are not paid their wages before the end of the week, they in their turn are unable, quote, to pay for the bread consumed by their families during the week before the end of the week. And Tremenhere adds on the evidence of witnesses, quote, it is notorious that bread composed of those mixtures is made expressly for sale in this manner, unquote. In many English and still more Scotch agricultural districts, wages are paid fortnightly and even monthly. With such long intervals between the payments, the agricultural laborer is obliged to buy on credit. They must pay higher prices and are in fact tied to the shop which gives them credit. Thus at Horningham and Wilts, for example, where the wages are monthly, the same flour that they could buy elsewhere for 1 shilling 10 pence per stone costs them 2 shillings 4 pence per stone. Quoting the reports of the inspectors of factories for the 31st of October 1853, the block printers of Paisley and Kilmarnock enforced, by a strike, fortnightly instead of monthly payment of wages, unquote. As a further pretty result of the credit given by the workman to the capitalist, we may refer to the method current in many English coal mines, where the laborer is not paid until the end of the month, and in the meantime receives sums on account from the capitalist, often in goods, for which the miner is obliged to pay more than the market price. This is known as the truck system. It's distinct from, but in some ways reminiscent of, the so-called company town, in which workers would be paid with company scrip instead of regular cash, and then that could only be spent at the company-owned stores. Continuing and quoting from the Children's Employment Commission, it is a common practice with the coal masters to pay once a month and advance cash to their workmen at the end of each intermediate week. The cash is given in the shop, i.e. the tommy shop which belongs to the master. The men take it on one side and lay it out on the other, unquote. And commenting, there's all kinds of other modern-day equivalents of this. I mean, they talked about the obvious adulteration of bread. We have in many ways similarly low-quality foods which are cheaper. And yes, there are some regulations, but at the same time, are these foods really nourishing? And as far as the payment schemes, I mean, you have things like payday loans today for people who need advances on the money that they haven't been paid yet, and so on. Back to the main text. Nevertheless, whether money serves as a means of purchase or as a means of payment, this makes no alteration in the nature of the exchange of commodities. The price of the labor power is fixed by the contract, although it is not realized until later, like the rent of a house. The labor power is sold, although it is only paid for at a later period. It will therefore be useful for a clear comprehension of the relation of the parties to assume provisionally that the possessor of labor power, on the occasion of each sale, immediately receives the price stipulated to be paid for it. We now know how the value paid by the purchaser to the possessor of this peculiar commodity, labor power, is determined. The use value which the former gets in exchange manifests itself only in the actual utilization, in the consumption of the labor power. The money owner buys everything necessary for this purpose, such as raw material, in the market, and pays for it at its full value. The consumption of labor power is at one and the same time the production of commodities and of surplus value. The consumption of labor power is completed, as in the case of every other commodity, outside the limits of the market or of the sphere of circulation. Accompanied by Mr. Moneybags and by the possessor of labor power, we therefore take leave for a time of this noisy sphere, where everything takes place on the surface and in view of all people, and follow them both into the hidden abode of production, on whose threshold there stares us in the face no admittance except on business. Here we shall see, not only how capital produces, but how capital is produced. We shall at last force the secret of profit-making. This sphere that we're deserting, within whose boundaries the sale and purchase of labor power goes on, is in fact a very Eden of the innate rights of man. There alone rule freedom, equality, property, and Bentham, pain and pleasure. Freedom, because both buyer and seller of a commodity, say of labor power, are constrained only by their own free will. They contract as free agents, and the agreement they come to is but the form in which they give legal expression to their common will. Equality, because each enters into relation with the other as a simple owner of commodities, and they exchange equivalent for equivalent. Property, because each disposes only of what is their own. And Bentham, because each looks only to themselves. The only force that brings them together and puts them in relation with each other is the selfishness, the gain, and the private interests of each. Each looks to themselves only, and no one troubles themselves about the rest. And just because they do so, do they all, in accordance with the pre-established harmony of things, or under the auspices of an all-shrewd providence, work together to their mutual advantage, for the common weal, and in the interest of all. On leaving this sphere of simple production, or of exchange of commodities, which furnishes the free trader vulgaris with their views and ideas, and with the standard by which they judge a society based on capital and wages, we think we can perceive a change in the physiognomy of our dramatis personae. That person who before was the money owner now strides in front as capitalist. The possessor of labor power follows as their laborer, the one with an air of importance, smirking, intent on business, the other timid and holding back, like one who is bringing their own hide to market and has nothing to expect but a hiding.